For years, Terry Irwin has carried her family through grief, rebuilding a world shattered the day Steve Irwin never came home. But nothing prepared her for the moment she realized her son, Robert Irwin, was changing in ways she could no longer ignore. The confident, joyful boy who once reminded her so much of Steve now seemed weighed down by pressures no 21-year-old should have to bear. And as his transformation deepened, Terry found herself confronting a heartbreaking fear she had never spoken out loud. What happened to the child she fought so hard to protect? The weight Terry never escaped. Long before the world knew her as the mother of Bindi and Robert, Terry Irwin was a young woman from Eugene, Oregon, shaped by a childhood spent rescuing injured animals and dreaming of a life dedicated to protecting wildlife. She built her own rehabilitation center, Cougar Country, in 1986, caring for wounded cougars, raccoons, bobcats, and bears. Her path seemed fixed: quiet, earnest conservation work in the United States. But everything changed in 1991 when she traveled to Australia and met Steve Irwin at his family's small reptile park. What began as a simple visit turned into a life-altering connection, a partnership built on shared purpose and an almost immediate sense of destiny. Within months, the two were building a future together, unaware of how short their time would truly be. When Steve died suddenly in 2006, Terry's world collapsed with brutal force. Overnight, she became a widow, a single mother, and the guardian of a global legacy. She described that time as living inside a fog, raising two grieving children while shouldering the responsibility of preserving Steve's message. There was no pause, no space for collapse. She managed Australia Zoo, expanded the wildlife hospital, led conservation programs, and guided Bindi and Robert through childhood under the harsh spotlight of public expectation. Every day, she reminded herself that her children needed strength, even when she felt she had none left to give. As the years passed, Terry found small comfort in seeing pieces of Steve reflected in both her children. Bindi carried his compassion and emotional depth. Robert carried his enthusiasm, his courage, and the bright-eyed joy that made millions of people around the world fall in love with the Irwins. For Terry, watching Robert grow felt like watching a second chance, something hopeful emerging from the tragedy that had nearly broken them. But hope is fragile. And somewhere along the line, Terry began noticing subtle shifts in her son, changes in his demeanor, the way he held himself, the heaviness behind his smiles. At first, she tried to dismiss them, telling herself that young adulthood is complicated and emotional. But soon the changes became too pronounced to ignore, and Terry realized she was facing a new fear, one she had never wanted to confront. Robert's early path. The boy who was meant to carry a legacy. Robert Irwin was born on December 1st, 2003, into a world unlike any other child's. While most toddlers grew up with toys scattered across the living room floor, Robert's playground was Australia Zoo. He learned to walk between enclosures, listened to the sounds of koalas in the trees, and watched his father, Steve Irwin, handle crocodiles with a confidence and enthusiasm that bordered on legendary. Even after Steve's death in 2006, when Robert was only 2, the world spoke of him as the son destined to continue the crocodile hunter's mission. Terry tried her best to shield him from the weight of those expectations, but they followed him everywhere as he grew. In his earliest childhood years, Robert showed unmistakable traits of his father's spirit. The curiosity, the wide grin, the fascination with every living creature. Terry often said that watching him talk about animals felt like watching Steve all over again. It was comforting at first, a reminder that her children carried pieces of the man she lost. But it also made Robert the center of attention long before he understood what that meant. By age 4, he was already appearing on television with his mother and sister. By 10, he was handling snakes and exotic animals on programs watched by millions. And by 14, he was a global phenomenon in his own right. With every successful appearance on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, every wildlife documentary he participated in, and every conservation project he joined, the world celebrated him as the next Steve Irwin. It was a compliment, one that came from love. But for a young boy trying to understand who he was without the father he barely remembered, it was also a quiet burden. Terry noticed this early, though she never said it publicly. She saw how deeply he wanted to honor Steve while also trying to become his own person. As Robert entered his late teens, this internal conflict intensified. He had the heart of a conservation warrior, but he was also a young man navigating fame, personal growth, and a legacy that millions expected him to fulfill without hesitation. Terry watched closely as those pressures, external and internal, began shaping him in ways she wasn't sure he was prepared for. The transformation had started long before anyone realized it. Fame, pressure, and the cracks that began to show. As Robert stepped into adulthood, the world applauded his poise, charm, and passion. He became not just a conservationist, but a global media figure, appearing on talk shows, traveling for wildlife work, and earning acclaim as a photographer. His image was polished, his persona warm, and his devotion to animals unwavering. But behind the scenes, the pressure mounted relentlessly. Robert wasn't just a young conservationist. He was the son of one of the most beloved cultural icons Australia had ever produced. Every step he took, every project, every public moment was compared to the path Steve Irwin once walked. By 2020, Robert's wildlife photography gained international attention, with exhibitions and awards placing him firmly among the most promising young photographers in the world. On the surface, everything seemed to be flourishing, but those closest to him, including Terry, saw signs of emotional strain. His schedule grew increasingly demanding, leaving little time for rest or reflection. Fans adored him, but the expectations were suffocating. He was expected to be fearless, endlessly enthusiastic, forever smiling, the embodiment of the Irwin legacy. Yet Robert was human, navigating heartbreaks, self-discovery, and overwhelming responsibility. His dating life, once private, became a topic of public fascination. His relationship with Rory Bucky, niece of the late Heath Ledger, made headlines when they appeared together at the Mission. Impossible. Dead Reckoning. Part 1 premiere in July 2023. For a brief moment, fans celebrated the couple. But when the relationship ended in February 2024 after 18 months, speculation spiraled. Media pressure intensified, with strangers analyzing every detail of Robert's personal life. To Terry, the breakup represented far more than a young man's first public romance ending. It was another weight added to his already heavy emotional load. By late 2024, rumors circulated about Robert's growing closeness to Charlotte Briggs, a former Australia Zoo staff member. Fans were intrigued, but insiders noted something deeper. Robert was becoming more guarded, less eager to share parts of his life. It was a subtle shift, but Terry recognized the signs instantly. She had seen this before in others consumed by public scrutiny: the slow retreat inward, the desire to protect oneself, the quiet exhaustion that builds when a person feels watched at every turn. And beneath all of it, Robert was grappling with something he couldn't escape: a legacy that felt both like a blessing and a shadow stretching endlessly behind him. The transformation that left Terry in tears. The turning point came in late 2024 and early 2025, when Robert began showing signs of a shift that neither fans nor family could ignore. The confident, energetic young man who once radiated the carefree spirit of his father now appeared different, quieter, heavier in expression, and increasingly distant from the public image he had maintained for years. What the world saw as a new phase, Terry recognized as something deeper, something that stirred an ache she had tried to bury since 2006. Robert's demeanor changed first. He spoke less in interviews, choosing his words with caution rather than enthusiasm. His tone, once bright and uplifting, carried a guarded edge. Friends close to the family described him as thoughtful but withdrawn, a young man wrestling with expectations he could no longer shoulder easily. For Terry, seeing this shift felt like watching the brightness of her son dim under a weight he didn't choose. She cried privately, overwhelmed by the fear that Robert, like Steve in his final years, was being consumed by the demands of a world that adored him but didn't always understand him. Then came the Bonds underwear campaign, Robert's viral, internet-breaking photo shoot that reintroduced him to the world in a way no one had expected. It was bold, confident, and shockingly far from the wholesome image the Irwins had carefully built for decades. Terry was reportedly a little surprised, even worried. The Irwin brand had always been tied to family-friendly conservation, not steamy modeling campaigns. At first, she questioned whether it aligned with what she and Steve built. She feared the backlash, the misinterpretation, the possibility that her son was straying too far from the mission that defined their lives. But when Robert explained his reasoning, that linking two iconic Australian names, Bonds and the Irwins, was a strategic move, a step toward carving out his own identity, Terry softened. She understood that her son wasn't rebelling, he was searching for himself. Yet even with that understanding, the emotional toll lingered. The shift in his appearance, the sudden muscular physique, the shift toward fitness branding, these changes raised questions she wasn't sure how to answer. To the public, it was just a photo shoot. To Terry, it was a sign that her son was growing into someone she wasn't sure she fully recognized anymore. Independence, rumors, and the fears a mother cannot hide. As Robert's transformation continued, another painful layer emerged, his growing desire for independence. For years, the Irwin family had lived under one roof at Australia Zoo, a choice rooted in closeness, shared responsibility, and the desire to honor Steve's mission as a united front. But insiders began whispering what Terry feared most, that such closeness might now be holding Robert back. Friends felt it was unhealthy for a 21-year-old to live with his entire family, especially one as high-profile and tightly bonded as the Irwins. They believed Robert needed room to grow, room to make mistakes, room to build a life outside of a legacy that defined every breath of his childhood. Terry understood this on a rational level. She'd seen Bindi marry young, start her own family, and struggle publicly with the pressures of early adulthood. She wasn't ready for Robert to follow that same path. Not yet. When rumors surfaced in late 2024 that Robert was quietly dating Charlotte Briggs, a former Australia Zoo staff member, Terry found herself torn. Insiders claimed Robert was waiting for his mother's approval before making the relationship public. That level of emotional dependence, while touching, left Terry conflicted. She wanted him to grow into his own life. But the thought of losing the last piece of Steve she saw reflected in her son felt like another wound she wasn't ready to reopen. Reports suggested that Terry wanted Robert to focus on his career, especially after his breakout success co-hosting I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in 2024. She was proud, deeply proud, of how far he had come in such a short time. That success had earned him the clout to take risks, to branch out, to redefine himself professionally. But as Robert began leaning into fitness culture, bodybuilding aesthetics, and high-profile modeling opportunities, Terry couldn't escape the fear that he was drifting toward an identity shaped more by outside pressures than by the mission she and Steve built together. This wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about fame. It was about watching her son step into a world that might not love him the way his father's world once had. Watching him walk a path with edges sharper than crocodile teeth. A mother's breaking point, and the question that haunts the Irwin legacy. By early 2025, the whispers, the pressure, and the visible changes in Robert converged into a moment Terry had long feared. The boy who once carried Steve's fire with pure innocence now seemed caught between worlds, one defined by the expectations of millions and another defined by the quiet, private struggles he rarely spoke about. Terry, who had spent nearly 2 decades reinforcing the Irwin legacy alone, now found herself watching her son reshape his identity in ways she didn't fully understand. And that uncertainty cut deeper than she expected. Part of the pain came from simple reality. Robert had never been allowed to grow up slowly. He never had anonymity, privacy, or the freedom to make quiet mistakes. He was born into global recognition, raised on camera, and expected to become a symbol before he became a man. Terry feared that the transformation she was witnessing, the guardedness, the introspection, the shift in demeanor, wasn't a phase, but the long-term impact of a lifetime lived under a spotlight he never asked for. She had seen this kind of pressure break people before, yet the moment that truly shook her was more emotional than dramatic. It came when Robert spoke about wanting to find his own path, a phrase simple to outsiders but devastating to a mother who had built her life around preserving the mission she shared with her late husband. Terry knew this wasn't defiance, it was growth. But growth, she realized, often requires stepping away from the very foundation that raised you. And for the first time, she faced the possibility that Robert might step away from the Irwin narrative entirely, not out of resentment, but necessity. The truth that haunted her was this: Steve's legacy was never meant to imprison their children, but to inspire them. Yet Terry could not shake the image of losing another part of Steve, not to tragedy, but to transformation. She wondered whether Robert was trying to escape the shadow of a man the world still mourns, or simply searching for a version of himself untouched by grief and expectation. In the quiet moments no one sees, Terry has cried not because Robert is lost, but because he is changing. And change, even when healthy, can feel like loss to a mother who has already endured the deepest heartbreak imaginable. But through every fear, every tear, every moment of doubt, one truth remains. Terry will stand by her son, even if his path leads him far from the one she once imagined. And Robert, no matter where he goes, will always carry a piece of Steve Irwin's spirit, whether the world recognizes it or not. What do you think about Robert's recent transformation? Do you believe he's simply growing into his own identity, or is he drifting too far from the Irwin legacy? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more powerful stories just like this.